Are you an e-commerce seller struggling to ship your own orders out on time? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about what are the considerations you should be making from should you be with a 3PL, what is a 3PL, and when is the right time to actually switch from doing your own fulfillment to a 3PL, or is it ever the right time for you? So in this video, we're going to walk through the way that I would be thinking about it and some of the ways that a 3PL can help you and some of the ways that shipping for yourself can help you long term. My name is Brennan and I own and operate a 3PL based out of Portland, Oregon. I started my whole journey in e-commerce almost 10, 11 years ago with my own brands. We were selling socks online, and so we were manufacturing and shipping our own product for 7 years before we started the 3PL out of the same building. So I've been on the brand side, I've been on the 3PL side, and I have a pretty good idea of what the pros and cons of each are. We've also helped a ton of brands transition from in-house fulfillment to working with a 3PL. And so I want to talk about some of the things there that made that transition easier, what made them ready to switch, and then what factors I would be thinking about if I was a brand owner doing my own fulfillment right now. So to start off, I think a good thing to understand is what is a 3PL? Well, a 3PL in the context of what we're talking about is a third party that will receive your inventory, put it in their warehouses, keep stock and inventory of all of it, and then ship the orders out as they come in. Typically, when you start e-commerce, you're shipping things out of your garage, and maybe you grow into something slightly bigger, and then you keep growing, and that's what a 3PL is. So a 3PL basically services a bunch of different brands, and there's a ton of efficiencies as a 3PL, right? Because if you're shipping for 30 different people, you're gonna stock the same packaging materials, you're gonna have the same labor across all of it. So that's what a 3PL is. A 3PL is just a giant fulfillment center for different e-commerce brands. Usually when you're starting out, a 3PL is probably not the right fit for you. A lot of 3PLs are going to require minimums or minimum order volumes. There's a variety of things that it doesn't make sense for a fulfillment center to work with you as a brand if you're not selling enough. But once you start to get to that threshold, which I typically tell people is usually like 100 orders a month minimum, maybe even 200, 250 minimum before it starts to become pretty economical, and 3PLs are willing to actually talk and work with you. But once you get to that point, I do think it's important to start evaluating, because your time's gonna be so sucked up by just shipping those packages out. Like, I shipped my own packages for years. I know how long it takes to ship 100, 200 packages, even if it's pretty straightforward, and then you have to get them to the post office and make sure that they get scanned in that same day. Like, there's so many of these other factors that it just ends up being a huge time suck. So if you're growing your brand like this and you're getting to that kind of threshold, I would probably at least look at a 3PL, unless you're doing something super custom where the 3PL is not going to be able to do that. Like if you're doing light manufacturing before shipping, 3PL is probably not going to be a great fit. But if you're shipping even somewhat standard products, I would consider at least looking at one and seeing if it might be a good fit. Now, if you don't want to go down the 3PL route, your other option is just continuing to expand and getting a little bit of your own setup going. Maybe like that's how we got started. We went into a 2,000 square foot space, and then we went into a 5,000 and so on. And it totally works fine. We're doing our own manufacturing, so it's a little bit different, but you can totally set up your own processes, and in a way, you're basically a really, really small fulfillment center, right? So this is a totally valid option too, and it just depends how much control you want over the process and what you want to do long-term with the brand. Now, we have a bunch of other videos that you can go check out that we talk really in-depth detail of like, are you ready to make the switch? How do you know what are the things to think about? But what I really want to take time in this video to do is talk about the actual transition and what the important pieces you should be doing, communicating with your 3PL, and how the entire process goes. So in the last year, I would say there's been at least 4 or 5 customers that we've worked with for the 3PL that have gotten rid of their own warehouses and moved fully into our 3PL. And the process, we've learned a ton, and throughout the process, we've learned a ton of things that make each one we do easier and easier. Usually the first question that we run into is, how do the new softwares talk to each other? A lot of people are coming off of, if you're running your own warehouse, shipping on like ShipStation, and as a 3PL, we have our own software that we use. And so we help get your Shopify hooked up to that, make sure they're syncing to both. And then the way we've done it is you literally choose a hard cutoff date once you have some inventory into the 3PL, which I'll talk about next. You choose a hard cutoff date, and then you say, okay, any orders after this date are going through the 3PL, any before need to come out of our own facility. This has worked pretty well, just requires a high level of communication with your 3PL. Now, the second point, which we kind of talked about there, is like, how do you know where to send inventory? Because you can't send it all, and you need to make sure you send enough. What we've typically seen is, this is depending on type of product, right? But usually you'll send 60-70% of your inventory to the 3PL. You'll obviously communicate with them ahead of time so you can make sure it gets loaded up quickly into inventory, so that when you are ready to make that switch, you're not sitting around waiting for 2 to 3 weeks while the warehouse is sitting on the inventory receiving it. Like, you want to get that inventory into the system as quick as possible so that you can make the switch and you don't have this 60-70% of your inventory just out there floating, right? Between those two, that is most of it. The other kind of hurdles that we see people run into are making sure your products are barcoded. Most 3PLs are going to require that they are barcoded because they scan everything, and if you're doing your own self-fulfillment, you might not be barcoding things because your people know the products well enough, but at a 3PL, it is important that things are barcoded for accuracy's sake, because if we're shipping for 30 brands, we can't trust our people necessarily to know every single product from every single brand. And then you get into, like, if you're doing apparel and there's 6 sizes of the same exact thing, too easy to make a mistake, which is why we enforce scanning. Now, the other question is, how do you actually move the goods? In our experience, we've actually helped arrange the shipment, whether that be freight or small parcel, to actually get the goods from the brand's warehouse into ours, just because our rates are usually better and we have access to carriers that those brands might not. Plus, sometimes figuring out how to pack all those things can be confusing, and so we've been able to help a lot in that area, which has been nice and something I didn't even know would be super helpful. But a lot of the brands, like, the more we're able to take off their plate and help, just like, hey, here's how we need to pack things, here's how things need to be labeled, and here's the labels, it's made the transition a whole lot easier. And as a 3PL, that is our job, is to help make your life as a brand much easier. So those are kind of the 3 things that are the largest kind of impactful factors that have made it easier when moving. And one interesting point is, or the question I'm thinking about is, why are these brands moving, right? Honestly, most of the time it has come down to brands that are shipping anywhere between 500 orders a month and 6,000-7,000 orders a month, that the overhead to actually have a lease, you're locked into a 3 to 5 year lease, right? You also are now managing the labor, and it just became too much where you're spending all your time on just the shipping and they aren't actually even able to go grow the company because they're just trying to get their existing orders out. Great problems to have, don't get me wrong, but it does become limiting at some point. So, and then there's also always the factor of, with a 3PL, your costs on shipments are probably going to go down a bit, and if they have multiple locations, you might be able to deliver to customers faster. So there's a lot of benefits. There's also a lot of cons, right? Like, you give up a lot of control. The process has to become a bit more standardized. You might lose the feeling of actually touching all of your stuff, as weird as that sounds. But anyways, there's a lot more we could dive into, but hopefully those 3 or 4 points are helpful things to think about, or at least understand how that process might work transitioning into a 3PL for the first time. So if you have any other questions, feel free to leave us a comment, and if you want to, give us a like, it helps us out. And yeah, any other questions, like I said, leave us a comment. I will answer them in a future video, and until then, happy shipping.